to all who believe. And definitely not least, let us say our pledge of allegiance to the Bible, okay? I pledge allegiance to the Bible, God's word. I will read a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. I will hide its words in my heart that I might not sin against God. All right, amen. Okay, let's sing a song. I'm thankful to be American. I'm glad to be American. I'm thankful to be American. I guess you can only see it because it's just too much trouble to get y'all to stand up. Okay? Sing out with me, okay? I'm thankful to be an American. I'm proud of the red, white, and blue. I'm thankful to be an American. America, I love you. In this God-blessed land of opportunity, I can be anything that I want to be. I'm thankful to be an American. America, I love you. America, America. I love you. Amen. All right. Well, let's see how we can take it up an offering every night for the Pauly family. Okay. And Lori Pauly has cancer. Okay. Very, very dangerous, life-threatening. So they had to go to California to get some special treatment for her. It's going to take a lot of money. And so we're taking up an offer. Brother John, you want to say anything about that at all?
Sure. Not only is it, we go boys against the girls, that's a point, but all the boys need these two things. Brother, sister, and brother. Consider the need, okay? To do tonight. Guys, can we do it tonight?
Yes. All right. Let's go to our next song here. Some people grumble, we gotta have, aren't you glad you're an American? I realize there's a lot of things that we can say bad about America, but we're sure there's a lot of things that we can say good, which is why people don't come here. Even if they have to do it illegally. Okay? Song, we hear you grumble. Grumble. Some people everybody, they want to talk, they want to accomplish, that's fun, let's do right happy, and everything seems fun, really to learn, that big stop, just that stop, and you everything has a time. Always thank the Lord is thankful for everything. In your way, that's what touch it every day. New faith I have, Lord, for rain before you may be good. Because you're perfect. The clothes aren't 10 old.
10 years.
You're only 7.
Years.
How can your clothes be 10 years old? He's only 7 years old.
Are you singing the song?
No.
I'm sure. But she's not wearing what she was wearing when she was 1 year old. Who wrote this? Maybe it's for other, maybe it's not just for kids. Maybe it's for grown-ups. You may not have much, your supper may be full. You may be too because your clothes are 10 years old. If you don't have a lot, give thanks to God for all you got. Just thank God. Voice that say, always thank the Lord each day for everything you bring away. Every day, every day, that's right to every day. Yeah, all right. Well, listen now. We're going to be talking about sacrifice tonight. Sacrifice, okay? People have to sacrifice in order for us to be able to sit here tonight. A lot of people have to sacrifice in order for us to be able to do that. You realize that people that are no longer even with us sacrificed their finances when they were raising a family, and the budget was tight, and money was hard to come by, but they put their money in and they were able to build this building and build this building next to the one that's attached to this building. And that took a great sacrifice to do that. And that's a great sacrifice to keep it up and keep it maintained. And it takes a lot of time. And people have other things to do. How many people have other things to do tonight to be here? I know I could be doing something else tonight, okay? But sometimes it's a sacrifice just to be here, right? And so sacrifice hurts sometimes, okay? And if a sacrifice doesn't cost you something, then it's really not a sacrifice, is it? So pay attention tonight as we do our sacrifice. Uncle Rob's not with us tonight to operate our time-space dilator. Whoa, we're just going to bypass that. We're just going to bypass that.
No, you have to, you gotta go back.
I came up with something else. And I think we can just, you know.
1777.
1777. So I'm looking at 777. That would be 816. Okay. So let's do this. Let's get out of here. Let's go do our, oh my, wait a second, I lost my everything. I lost my everything. I lost my cursor, there it is. And what's this? VBS. And let's see, let's go to Great American Time Machine. All right. And let's go to, let's try this. This is going to be a little different tonight. Like I was saying. Okay, oh. That's what happens when you try to bypass the time-space dilator. All right, now we got to go to 816 and so it'll be about. It's close second from 1776 because there is no 76. So, or 77. Yeah, within a year or half a year. And I do have a great addition for the next time. You may even be able to do it tomorrow night, but I don't know. That's all kind of participation. All right, but wait a minute. Hold on. Time out. Everybody close your eyes. Hey, hallelujah. 1777. All right. I feel like forward here. I feel like riding a horse somewhere. Yeah. All right, photo op. All right, so listen, we're ready to dismiss. So our red flags can go wherever they go, and our white flags can operate in the opposite direction. Okay, white flags, and the blue flags. Y'all can go wherever y'all go.
This way.
I think I need to calm that down. I'm not real good at this high-tech stuff. So, where's Gary? There. Didn't see behind that white sheet. But you're going to be going tomorrow evening, you're going to be going around to the classes, right? Pardon me? Yeah. Okay. You heard that. Who heard that? Gary. That's what you heard. Perfect, okay. So because you're not going to be here tomorrow night, but you're going to be representing George Washington Carver, right? Yep. And I thought maybe we would take a look at some of that Black history, if I can call it that, tonight, because you won't be here tomorrow night to enjoy it. Can we do that? That's awesome. Okay. And so let's see if I can blow everybody's eardrums out. You've been working on it. Yeah, I've been working on it. Where am I at? Just give me a minute, and I have to go here. Oh, you say here, here, here. See how loud this is.
In the fierce battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? What is the story and inspiration behind the early civil rights movement? And did the pastors and religious leaders of America play a role in the abolition of slavery? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shaped the lives of these great black men and women? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
When God tells history in the Bible, He doesn't gloss it up. He tells it just the way that it happened. He tells the good, the bad, the ugly.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
There's no way you can separate political parties from black history unless you want to be politically incorrect, and then that requires a sacrifice of the truth. And I'm not going to do that.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
Nearly every Southern Republican Party was started by blacks. not whites.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
The history of black Americans begins in 1619 when the first load of slaves sailed up the James River in Jamestown, Virginia. Slavery introduced into America. The first history of African Americans is involuntary. For the next 150 years, black American history is really centered around the states because we don't have a nation, we don't have any kind of a national government. It's very much like it would have been in Europe. All the different states were really like nations. So the first real concerted national effort to end slavery occurs with the beginning of the national government. The first efforts to end slavery really began in 1787 when they had the Constitutional Convention. All the states have come together and then trying to figure out how do we have a nation now. And within that group, you had some pro-slavery, you had a lot of anti-slavery. Right. Overwhelming majority of states were anti-slavery, but some were pro-slavery. But again, they were just. When we signed the Declaration of Independence, a number of states started wiping out slavery right then. We had to have slavery before that because the king would not allow us to end slavery. Well, now that we separate from Great Britain, we can end slavery. So here you have Massachusetts and you have Vermont, and you have Connecticut, all these states ended slavery. Now they're in this federal constitutional convention with some states that are pro-slavery, with a whole bunch that are anti-slavery. There was a lot of fight that went over that. One of the clauses in the Constitution to which critics today point to say slavery is part of the Constitution, always had been, it's part of the national psyche, always been this attitude of enslaving African Americans. They point to what's called the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause was actually an anti-slavery clause that was put in the Constitution, but we never hear that today. We never hear that 3/5 was anti-slavery. But it's interesting, the testimony of those who would know best, the ones that I would look to if I wanted to know what African Americans thought about the 3/5 clause, I'd go to somebody like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, we know him from back around 1838. He escaped from slavery and he went to New York. And as he was against slavery in New York, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society heard him speak and said, "Oh, you need to go on the road full time and speak against slavery." So here's Frederick Douglass, who had been in Maryland enslaved, who's now escaped to the North. He's free. So he goes on the road full time to speak against slavery. Now, interestingly, in the 2 years that he was in New York, what's called the radical abolitionists were the ones who trained him. And they said the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. It is filled with the Founding Fathers' desire to keep slavery. He had been trained in that for 2 years. But when he agreed to go on the road full time for the Massachusetts Abolition Society, he had the integrity to say, I've been taught about these documents, but I better read them for myself. And so he went back and read the documents. He read the debates. He read all the things that went on. In his autobiography, he said that he underwent a radical change of opinion. Instead of finding that the documents were pro-slavery, he said he found them to be anti-slavery in every provision. He said, by the way, if they are pro-slavery, why does the word slave or slavery, why does none of that appear anywhere in the Constitution? And they don't appear. In the 1860 presidential election, there was a split in the Democratic Party, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Both factions supported slavery, but while Southern Democrats were willing to split the United States to form their own nation, Northern Democrats refused to do so. Northern Democrats voted for Stephen Douglas for president, while Southern Democrats voted for John C. Breckinridge. With this split in the Democratic vote, Republican Abraham Lincoln was then elected with only 40% of the popular vote, but 59% of the Electoral College vote. Republicans also won a majority in the U.S. House and Senate in that election, thus giving Republicans control of the lawmaking process for the very first time. Given the bold anti-slavery and pro-civil rights positions set forth by Republicans in their platforms, it was obvious to Democrats what was about to occur. The anti-slavery and pro-civil rights position of the Republicans were about to become reality. What was the Democratic response? Southern Democrats left Congress and took their states with them, forming a nation that described itself as the slave-holding Confederate States of America. While Northern Democrats did not support secession, they nonetheless generally supported slavery and opposed civil rights for Black Americans. In short, the main difference between Southern and Northern Democrats at that time was their view on secession, not slavery. However, returning to the election of 1860, with the Republicans firmly in control of the federal government, they quickly began implementing significant changes. In 1862, Republicans abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in the southern states in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation was eagerly anticipated, and many Black Americans gathered in groups around clocks or watches, eagerly awaiting the arrival of midnight on December the 31st, 1862, for the proclamation was to take effect on the first moment of January the 1st, 1863. Frederick Douglass was in attendance at one such midnight rally, waiting for the proclamation to become official. When that moment arrived, a celebration erupted, and Douglass exclaimed,
"It was one of the most affecting and thrilling occasions I ever witnessed, and a worthy celebration of the first step on the part of the nation in its departure from the bondage of the ages."
In 1860, in that election where the Democrats had their platforms and Dred Scott's great, Republicans had theirs, says, no, it's not. You had the election that time between the Democrats and the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln running as a Republican. The Democrats actually broke and split. There was the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats said slavery is absolutely fine and we're willing to leave the Union if these Republicans try to end slavery. You had the Northern Democrats up through New York and elsewhere that said, we think slavery is fine, but we're not willing to break up the Union over it. So when he gets elected, the Southern Democrats said, we told you we're going to leave if he gets elected, because if he gets elected, he's promised to end slavery. So you had 11 Democrat states secede from the Union. Now, we now say the South seceded from the North. No. Every Southern Democrat in the House, every Southern Democrat in the Senate left and started a new nation. I have the founding documents of that nation. They call it the slave-holding nation of the Confederacy. That's in their title. The speech given by their Vice President, Alexander Stephens, said that slavery is the cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy. So you have 11 states that have broken away to have a slave nation. That's what the Civil War is about. So now Republicans in one election, not only was Abraham Lincoln elected, but Republicans took the House and the Senate in one election. So within 7 years, they've gone to be a majority party. They started cranking out civil rights laws like crazy. This is one of the early civil rights laws. This is a law to secure equality before the courts. In other words, race no longer had anything to do with the courts. It was prior to this that if you were black, you couldn't testify in court, you couldn't go before a court to bring a suit, you were excluded from the legal process. Here's a bill that's designed to give equal pay for soldiers. If you're black or if you're white, you're going to get paid the same.
What are the dates of these?
This bill is 1864. This is March the 5th of 1864.
And is that an original?
That's the original. This is the original as introduced in the Senate. This is Senate Bill 145. And this is the original Senate bill. Here's the House bill. This is H.R. 51. This is the bill that created the Freedmen's Bureau, another civil rights bill. So Republicans are cranking out civil rights bills like crazy.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
There was indeed a clear difference between the philosophy of the Republicans and of Democrats on the issue of race and racial equality. Southern Democrats had been willing to form an entire nation on the foundation of white supremacy, and there was no doubt that the South was strongly Democratic. As a leading South Carolina Democrat testified during an 1871 congressional hearing,
For the purposes of this hearing, sir, could you provide a breakdown along party lines as exists in your state?
Almost 999 out of 1,000 of the decent people of South Carolina belong to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is composed entirely of the colored people.
when it came time for the presidential election of 1864, Southern Democrats were still fighting against the Union. Therefore, the presidential candidate for the Democrats that year was a Northern Democrat, Union General George B. McClellan. McClellan was actually running for president against his own commander-in-chief, but there was a clear difference between the two. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had twice replaced McClellan for failing to obey Lincoln's orders to launch aggressive attacks against the Confederacy. And not surprisingly, the anti-black tone of this Northern Democrat shone through in his presidential campaign. For example, examine this 1864 campaign piece for General McClellan. Why does he urge citizens to vote for him? Because, as he explains,
our bloody Civil War has now lasted nearly 4 years under the mismanagement of Abraham Lincoln. Nearly 1 million white men have been sacrificed.
Notice another of his complaints.
Lincoln has declared his intention to convert the Civil War into a war for forcible abolition and Negro equality, social and political.
According to McClellan, since white lives were being lost, and since Republicans were seeking both abolition and Negro equality, McClellan argues that he, as a Democrat, should be elected so that he could halt those policies. Republicans also took clear positions in that 1864 presidential campaign. The 1864 Republican platform therefore called for a constitutional amendment to completely abolish slavery, and work was begun in Congress almost immediately on that amendment. That same year, President Lincoln won re-election to a second term. It was in 1865 that the Civil War finally came to a close. The nation of slaveholding states had been defeated. President Lincoln and the black troops of the 29th Connecticut Regiment visited Richmond, the former capital of the Confederate States of America. An officer in that black regiment recorded the scene.
As the president passed along the street, the colored people waved their handkerchiefs, hats, and bonnets and expressed their gratitude by shouting repeatedly, "Thank God for his goodness. We have seen his salvation." The white soldiers caught the sound and swelled the numbers, cheering as they marched along. All could see the president. He was so tall. One woman shouted, "Thank you, dear Jesus, for this sight of the great conqueror." No wonder tears came to the president's eyes when he looked on the poor colored people who were once slaves and heard the blessing uttered from thankful hearts and thanksgiving to God and Jesus. Thousands of colored men in Richmond would have laid down their lives for President Lincoln.
You're proving to us the mindset of founding fathers.
Yes.
We're moving into the mid-1800s, but the intent and the original intent based upon fact of original documents sitting right here on this set right now.
Well, that's why they call themselves the Republican Party. They want to go back to the original intent. They want to go back to the founding. And so they believe all of these laws were consistent with what the founders had tried to do in those early laws.
Wow.
So this is a reflection of original intent, even though it's 70 years later.
We had moved away 70, 80 years. We had moved really far away from the original intent of the founding fathers, and this was a correction of that pinch.
That's right.
Yeah.
That 35 years in Congress from 1820 to 1854, 1855, were reversing a lot.
Okay, so you just made a very important observation. And you said it took, because we're fast forwarding from the 1770s to the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. And he said 60, 70 years is gone, and America has digressed because the original intent of independence is that everyone has certain inalienable rights, right, by their creator, that all men are created equal. And all of a sudden, America digressed because you had people that were pro-slavery, and they were continuing that. So America slid back, if you will, but with the in the mid 1800s, that whole issue came back on the front burner, if you will, and Abraham Lincoln was fortunately elected president and able to say, we're annihilating once and for all. This thing is over. This is done. We thought we were done with this 78 years ago, but we're really done with that. Okay, and so it's important that we understand that. It's important that people don't say that, America, that they understand that America was not founded on slavery. America was not. The first colonists that went to Jamestown, okay, down in Virginia, they were the ones that brought the slaves with them. The Pilgrims were way up north, and they're just seeking religious freedom and religious liberty, which the concept is completely new, okay, to everyone. They didn't bring the slaves, okay? They were looking for, they believed in equality. Thomas Jefferson believed in equality. George Washington, all those folks, even though George Washington was from Virginia, if you read, if you were to get this series, you'll hear David Parker talking about how George Washington had entire families of slaves in his estate, but he was keeping them together for what? For protection, okay? And he basically gave his life savings, his inheritance to protect those folks, and under in a civil arena that was not conducive to abolition. I guess I could say that. Anyway, just wanted to bring that up.
The early laws. They said, George Washington said no slavery in federal territories. We don't like that law. At that time, under Thomas Jefferson, Congress passed this law that said no more slave trade. We don't like that law. So they went through and taken all these laws that were passed early Congresses by the Founding Fathers. We disagree with all that. We're going a different direction. So it's a complete reversal. So the Party says, no, we're going back to the principles of the Republic. That's why they call themselves Republican Party. So there was a period of time we got away. Now we're headed back. And significantly, we come to an election in 1864 while we're still at war. Now, what's interesting is all these Southern Democrats have seceded and formed their own state. So it's going to be pretty easy to guess who's going to win the election. I mean, the Republicans now have the majority because they're still in the Union. This is a significant document right here. It's a very delicate document, if I can pick it up. This is a platform of the Republicans and the Democrats in 1864. That little jewel right there says forth the Republican platform and the Democrat platform. But what makes this significant, this is the first document to call for a constitutional amendment to end slavery. See what happened? They said, well, we're passing all these civil rights laws, but it's just taking too long. Let's just get a constitutional amendment and stop this thing right now.
And what year was that?
This is 1864. You see, what happened as a result of this election, Republicans got back in power, and they promptly introduced the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. So they're put back in power, they promised to do it, and they introduced the 13th Amendment, and significantly, they voted on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery while the Civil War is still going on. So we're talking in January and February of 1865, they have the vote in the House and the Senate to abolish slavery. Now, at that time, there were 200 members of Congress, Democrat and Republican, because at that time you still had all the Northern Democrats in. So all the Northern Democrats are still in Congress. Southern Democrats have their own nation now. Northern Democrats still in. So you get Northern Democrats and Republicans, 200 members of Congress. 137 members voted to abolish slavery. When they voted, shortly after the vote, this was produced nationally. This right here is a picture of all 137 members of Congress who voted to abolish slavery. Everyone. And it's got Abraham Lincoln right at the center because he was leading the charge on the 13th Amendment. Now, under the Constitution, a president has no role in a constitutional amendment. Wow. The president does nothing. This is the only constitutional amendment in American history signed by a president of the United States. He did it symbolically to say, I know I've got nothing to do with passing the amendment officially, but I want you to know I'm behind this. So he signed it. Now, at that time, you had 118 members of Congress that were Republican. You had 82 members of Congress that were Democrat. As it turns out, 118 out of 118 Republicans voted to end slavery. Only 19 out of 82 Northern Democrats voted to end slavery. So that's why you only have 137. You see, you have 23% of Democrats in the North who want to end slavery. 3/4 didn't, but you have 100% of Republicans who want to end slavery. So the 13th Amendment is passed. It goes to the states. It is ratified.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
When the vote had been taken in Congress on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the chambers had been packed from wall to wall with expectant observers. When the numbers were counted and it was announced that the amendment had passed, a roar erupted from the thousands in the chamber. Hats were thrown and voices were raised in exuberant cheers. Congress had voted to end slavery. How should something that profound be celebrated? Members of the House asked that a sermon be preached to commemorate the event. And whom did they ask to preach the sermon? The Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Garnett became the first African American to speak in the halls of Congress, and he delivered this sermon. Today, it may sound strange to hear that there was a sermon preached in the Capitol. In fact, on December the 4th, 1800, shortly after Congress first moved into the Capitol building, Congress authorized that on Sundays, the Capitol would be used for church services. By 1867, the largest church in Washington, D.C. was the one that met inside the U.S. Capitol. Reverend Garnett preached this sermon on Sunday, February the 12th, 1865, and it was powerful. He began that sermon with a recollection of his own personal experiences.
What is slavery? Too well do I know what it is. I was born among the cherished institutions of slavery. My earliest recollection of parents, friends, and the home of my childhood are clouded with its wrongs. The first sight that met my eyes was my Christian mother enslaved.
Garnett then reviewed the prominent historical leaders of both church and state who had strongly opposed slavery.
The other day, when the light of liberty streamed through this marble building and the hearts of a noble band of patriotic statesmen leaped for joy, in this, our national capital, shook, foundations adone with the shouts of a ransomed people. Then methinks the spirits of Washington, Jefferson, the James, the Adams, and Franklin, and Lafayette, Giddings, and Lovejoy, and those of all the mighty and glorious dead remembered by history because they were faithful to truth, justice, and liberty, were hovering over this august assembly. Though unseen by mortal eyes, doubtless they joined the angelic choir and said, "Amen."
So now for states to come back into the United States, these 11 southern states that broke away to have a slave nation to get back in, this is the oath of loyalty you had to take to get back into the United States. To come into the United States, you have to swear before Almighty God, number one, that you will obey the laws pertaining to civil rights and slavery and the new constitutional amendments, and two, that you'll uphold the Constitution of the United States, which now has the 13th Amendment in it. And by the way, to show you how serious they took the oath, they didn't take an oath on the Bible. They didn't just raise their right hand and say, "So help me God." They take an oath on the holy evangelist of Almighty God. You see, we know that when we put our hands on the Bible, we're putting it on the Gospels. That's Jesus Christ. We claim to be a Christian nation. We're swearing on Jesus Christ, whom we claim to follow, that we will obey the Constitution, and we're swearing on the Gospels that we will obey the civil rights laws. This was a serious oath. I mean, this is the official document put up by the United States, and you're swearing on the holy evangelist of Almighty God. Now, the very states would put out this document as well. But I mean, this is part of our history. So because of the 13th Amendment, for the first time, African Americans across the South are free. Now, they were freed in the Emancipation Proclamation, but the South is pretty much ignoring that. So now we got a constitutional amendment, and you're swearing you're going to uphold the Constitution. So now you got to recognize blacks are free. Because they were free, they could register to vote. They started registering to vote. They started electing blacks to office across the South like crazy. Because of the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery, Black Americans, particularly in the South, could now enjoy their first real taste of civil rights, their first genuine opportunity for political participation. Within a year, blacks were registering to vote and were forming political parties across the South. For example, at a rally in Houston, Texas on July the 4th, 1867, 150 blacks and 20 whites formed the Republican Party of Texas. And Black Americans also started other Southern Republican parties as well. For a few years, Republicans became the political majority in most of the Southern states. Those Republican legislatures moved quickly to protect voting rights for African Americans, prohibit segregation, establish public education, and open public transportation, state police, schools, and other institutions to Black Americans. Not only were the Southern legislatures at that time Republican, but at least for a few years, nearly every Southern legislature included many Black legislators. In fact, the first 42 blacks elected to the state legislature in Texas were all Republicans. And in Louisiana, the first 95 Black representatives and the first 32 Black senators were, again, all Republicans. Similarly, in Alabama, the first 103 blacks elected to the state legislature were all Republicans. In Mississippi, the first 112 black legislators were Republicans. In South Carolina, the first 190. In Virginia, the first 46. In Florida, the first 30. And the same in North Carolina. And in Georgia, 41 blacks were elected to the state legislature, all as Republicans. The Republican Party of Texas was founded in Houston on the 4th of July, 1867, by 150 blacks and by 20 whites. Nearly every Southern Republican Party was started by blacks, not whites. Well, of course, in those states, they're opposing this. The racists are really out. Democrats are saying this is not fair. And because they would not recognize the civil rights laws, even though they swore to do so, that's why the 14th Amendment was passed. The 14th Amendment says every freed slave now has the rights and citizenship of every other citizen. Because in the South, Southern states are saying, well, those blacks might be freed, but they're sure not citizens of our state. Well, the 14th Amendment says, well, yes, they are. Any right of citizen. And because of the 14th Amendment, we can now elect blacks to the federal Congress. These guys right here. That's the first 7 blacks elected to the federal Congress, right there. This guy is the first black U.S. Senator, Hiram Rhodes Rebels. Oh, dare I say, he's a preacher of the gospel. He was a missionary. He was a chaplain in the Civil War. He raised 3 black regiments for the Union Civil War. He went on to become the president of Alcorn College. And over on this side, really cool guys, Robert Brown Elliott and Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey, by the way, is the first black elected to the House of Representatives. He actually served as Speaker of the House. A black served as Speaker, yeah. All 7 of these guys are Republicans. Matter of fact, the first 23 blacks elected to the federal Congress were all Republicans. Now, you want to get embarrassed, there is a great website called Neglected Voices. Neglected Voices are the speeches of the first 23 blacks who served in Congress. Now, half of these guys have been educated in a 5-year period, and they were self-educated. They taught themselves. I'm embarrassed to read those speeches because it takes me a dictionary to understand what they're saying. Their word level, their vocabulary level, their syntax, sentence structure, way over anything I would ever think about saying or doing. I get so inspired reading these guys. I mean, here they are. 5 years ago, they're slaves. Now they're members of Congress, and you read their speeches, and it'll throw you through the roof. It'll lift you right off your chair to see what these guys did. 4 of these guys became university presidents. Half of them became teachers. Several were pastors. I mean, it's unbelievable what these guys did in a short period of time. Wow. We never hear that today. So that aspect of American history that deals with ending slavery and starting forward progress for African Americans, wonderful time in history filled with wonderful individuals who fought. There's a lot of tragedy involved, but there's a lot of victory involved, and these guys are representative of that time. It's a wonderful time in American history.
For more information on the American Heritage Series or to find books and other resources,
there's no way that I can adequately tie in. On 4th of July, I demonstrated with the PowerPoint message how the left is doing everything they can to keep things stirred up people, blacks against the whites, the straights against the sodomites, the rich against the poor, the men against the women. Keep things stirred up, keep things disunified. But we're seeing that it was the Republican Party that got this whole thing off the ground for African Americans, all right? And how the whole thing got turned around back in the 20th century, I would not adequately be able to represent how that took place. I would misrepresent it, so you'll have to go and do your own research. But I would encourage you to keep in mind who's trying to keep things stirred up. Okay? I will not repeat the words of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who back in the 60s, when he was instilling or initiating much of the affirmative action. Is that what it was? Affirmative action stuff? Well, the welfare things. I won't repeat his words. Okay, but if you studied it out, you know why he was doing it. He was doing it simply to get votes. He wasn't doing it because it was right. And a lot of what he's done is kept a lot of people in bondage to that welfare system. And so people that were free ended up going back into bondage as a result. And it's very, very sad. I don't know if there's anybody that has thoughts, questions, comments. Right? And not that I have all the answers before we go on to the next section. Are we okay? Am I okay? You doing all right? Okay. And we'll close that out. And after this.
In the fierce battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shape the lives of these great black men and women? Discover the forgotten and astonishing.
When this narrator is talking, I can understand virtually every word he's saying. When Dave Barton and these other people and the actors are talking, my hearing is so shot, I'm catching the word here and there, okay? And so anyway, that's it's better, I guess, if you listen to it through headphones or something, but you don't have to. Okay?
Story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, America taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
The whole black history aspect, it's a very partisan thing, but we hear nothing about it, but it is so well documented.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
Why is it so many blacks were the victims of Klan? It's real simple. If you were black in America, you were Republican back then.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
Had it not been for Republicans, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 would not have passed.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
African American history has been a steady procession of progress, but so much of that progress really began to accelerate in the era that we call Reconstruction. That's where you have the introduction of the first civil rights amendments to the Constitution. The first civil rights constitutional amendment was done in 1865. That was the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery. It was done during the Civil War. It was a very partisan amendment.
Right.
In that amendment, you had 100% of Republicans who voted to end slavery. You only had 23% of Democrats who wanted to end slavery. Right after that amendment was done, we come to the end of the Civil War. So now the South that had really separated to form a pro-slavery nation, and that's not my opinion, that is their secession documents.
Right.
The documents of secession of the South, of those 11 states that seceded, said that they did so to preserve slavery. The Confederate Constitution actually totally prohibits any state from ending slavery. That's how set they were on keeping slavery, is they're claiming states' rights, but they won't even allow their own states to end slavery. So they're very adamant on that. The speech, one of the early speeches in the Confederacy given by the Vice President, Alexander Stephens, called slavery the cornerstone of the Confederacy. And it literally was. So you get to the end of the Civil War, shortly after you abolish slavery. Now you've got all these states who separated to have slavery, and they've got to come back into the Union somehow. But you've got to convince them that if you're going to get back in, you have to do so upholding the 13th Amendment. Slavery's got to be over. Well, they wouldn't. They said, all right, so what? You freed all the slaves, but they're not going to be citizens of our state. We're not going to let them be citizens of Louisiana or Georgia or Texas or whatever. So Congress says, oh, let's do a little arm twisting here. So they come up with the 14th Amendment that says that a freed slave is a citizen of the state in which he lives. So what had happened was in the South, you had two types of citizens. You had state citizens and you had others just living there. Free blacks who can't be citizens. The federal Constitution says, no, that stops right now. You live in a state, you're a citizen of that state, that's the end of it. So that when it came time to vote on that in the federal Congress, now remember after the Civil War, the Southern Democrats have now joined back to the Union. So we had the Northern Democrats, we had the Southern Democrats, we had the Republicans, they're all back together, and so they're back in Congress now, Northern and Southern Democrats and Republicans. It comes time to vote on the 14th Amendment that says that these former slaves get civil rights. Not a single Democrat in Congress voted for the 14th Amendment. Not a single, it's a matter of public record, not a single one.
What year was that?
That was 1868. You still have trouble in the southern states. There's a lot going on that says, well, they may be citizens, but we're going to pass laws that say that colors of citizens can't vote. You can't have blacks vote. So Congress came in 1870 and passed the 15th Amendment that says you cannot be deprived of your right to vote on the basis of your color. Real simple stuff. It's a reaction to what's going on in the southern states. The 15th Amendment is what guarantees blacks the right to vote. People think, well, it's the Voting Rights Act. No. The Voting Rights Act does not grant right to vote. Voting Rights Act only helps enforce certain counties that used to use literacy tests. It's a very specific law. The right to vote is given by the 15th Amendment. It is unabridgable. I mean, it is right there, real simple. The new constitutions were eventually passed, and a number of black Americans were elected to national office under those new constitutions. This 1872 print by Currier and Ives shows the first 7 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress. Significantly, all 7 were Republicans. On the left side of the picture is Hiram Rhodes Revels from Mississippi. An ordained minister, he served as a missionary and pastor, recruited 3 black regiments, and was a chaplain during the Civil War. Revels became America's first black U.S. senator. Next is Benjamin Turner of Alabama. Turner was a slave during the Civil War, but within 5 years after the war, he had become a wealthy and prosperous businessman. Next is Robert DeLarge of South Carolina. Born as a slave, within 3 years of the end of the war, he was serving in the State House. He also chaired the Republican Party's platform committee and became a statewide elected official. Next is Josiah Walls of Florida. Walls was a slave during the Civil War and was forced to fight for the Confederate Army. After he was captured by Union troops, however, he promptly enlisted as a Union soldier and even became an officer. After his election to Congress, his credentials were challenged by Democrats and he was twice sent home. He was reelected after the first challenge, but during the second challenge, Democrats regained control of Florida and he was prevented from returning. Next is Jefferson Long of Georgia. Born as a slave, he was self-educated and built a thriving business. However, when elected to Congress as a Republican, Democrats boycotted his business, causing him great financial losses. Long was the first Black American to deliver a congressional speech in the U.S. House. Next is Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. Born a slave, he actually served briefly as Speaker of the U.S. House and was in Congress longer than any other Black American from that era. The seventh is Robert Brown Elliott, also of South Carolina. He was well educated, reading in Spanish, French, and Latin. In Congress, he led in the passage of civil rights bills over the strident opposition of congressional Democrats, and he later became Speaker of the House in the state legislature. As you move forward, because of the 14th Amendment, we can elect African Americans to Congress, and so these guys, they're all Republicans, they joined with they passed 23 civil rights laws. Those 23 civil rights laws they passed, they ended segregation. They said you can no longer have distinctions on the basis of marriage. You can't have distinctions on the basis of property. You can't have distinctions in the military. I mean, it was really terrible. The things that, well, you can have courts for white, but you can't let blacks go into court. Now, whites can own property, blacks can't own property. So they have all these things. It gets wiped out. 23 laws that wipe all that out. The last civil rights law that they passed was in 1875. Do you know the next time Congress passed a civil rights law? It was 89 years later. Between 1861 and 1875, 14 years, we passed 23 civil rights laws. It stopped in 1875, and we didn't do it again until 1964. Why? Because in 1876, Democrats regained partial control of Congress. When Republicans had House and Senate and President, they're zipping these civil rights laws through. 1876, Democrats get back to House. That stops right there. Well, so for the next period of time, what you have is you've stopped civil rights laws, and in the South, you've kind of lost the end of Reconstruction, and the South is starting to get really violent now. You have all these slave owners, all these racist mentality people who are willing to form their own nation on the basis of race, and now you're trying to say that my elected representatives are black. I'm not going to do this. Well, in Democratic states, not only do you have Republicans, you've got black Republicans. So nationally, in 1866, to stop this forward progress, there was a group that was started to keep Republicans out of office. The group that was started in 1866, we recognize today, but it was the Ku Klux Klan. It was started by Democrats. And people say, well, they were started to whack blacks. No, they weren't. They were started to whack Republicans. You see,
okay, that's huge.
Yeah, just let me
all those
stop you right there for a
off. Listen up.
Restate that if you would.
the Klan was started in 1866 by Democrats to whack Republicans and allow Democrats to regain control. But why is it so many blacks were the victims of the Klan? It's real simple. If you were black in America, you were Republican back then.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
The Klan terrorized black Americans through murders and public floggings. Relief was granted only if they promised not to vote for Republican tickets. In violation of this oath was punishable by death. And since the Klan was targeted against Republicans in general, it did not limit its violence simply to black Republicans. In this old illustration, the Klan in North Carolina is about to hang a white Republican. And in 1871, a black U.S. congressman from South Carolina, Joseph Hayne Rainey, reported an incident concerning an elderly man named Dr. John Winsmith, a white Republican state senator.
The doctor, a man nearly 70 years of age, had been to town. Returning home late, he soon afterward retired. A little after midnight, he was aroused by someone knocking violently at his front door.
Get out of here! Stop
The Klan shot down this state senator, a white state senator, because he was a Republican and was fighting for the rights of blacks in his state. In that hail of bullets, Dr. Winsmith was hit 7 times. However, he survived the shooting and lived to testify before Congress about the attack made on him by the Klan. This is a Klan push card from 1868, about the size of a baseball card. It is entitled Radical Members of the South Carolina Legislature. It shows 63 radicals. They were all Republicans. The Democrats called Republicans radicals because the Republican Party was biracial and allowed blacks to vote and participate in the political process, thus making them radical in the Democrats' eyes. Of the 63 radicals or Republicans in the South Carolina Legislature, 50 were black and 13 were white. On the back of this card, all the names of the radical Republicans were listed. Evidently, if the Klan wanted to pay a night visit, as they had to Senator Winsmith, with the help of this card, they would know exactly who they were looking for. It's often associated with the lynchings, and these are some of the most abominable pictures in history, but these are pictures of actual lynchings. 4,800 Americans were lynched. Now, out of the 4,800 that were lynched, 1,300 were white, 3,500 were black.
We have never heard that before.
We've never heard 1,300 white lynched. I thought it was just lynching blacks. No, they were lynching Republicans. But again, back at that point in American history, if you were black, you were a Republican. You couldn't lynch every white you saw. Some of them might be Democrats. So you have to find out who they are. And that's why you have these little cards to identify the whites and the blacks that are Republicans, so you know who you're going after. People say the Klan wasn't partisan. Really? That's kind of interesting that as you get into the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the Klan was actually a wing of the Democrat Party. Matter of fact, George Wallace, who ran for governor in the South, a very famous name in the South, he lost his first election because he refused to accept the Klan endorsement in the Democrat primary. So the second time he ran for office, he accepted the Klan endorsement and won the primary. You go into Texas, Ma Ferguson, she had trouble. She wouldn't accept the Klan primary, and it kept her from having a cohesive win as Texas governor. And she eventually became Texas governor. But this was a significant part of the Democrat Party. It was an entire wing in the Democrat Party. And as you look, here's a picture of a Klan parade. You actually in Washington, D.C. had 40,000 members marching the Klan parade at the turn of the century. They included U.S. senators, U.S. reps, Supreme Court justices, members of the Democrat Party.
When would that picture?
This picture is going to be taken in about 1910. One of the great Klan recruiting films of all time is called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is really one of the first films that was ever done, a motion picture, and it shows the Klan as heroes saving the South from all the blacks. And by the way, guess where that film was shown? It was shown in the White House. It was the first film ever shown in the White House. It was shown by Democrat President Woodrow Wilson. When he became president, a number of blacks already held federal office. He got rid of them, got them out of office. Teddy Roosevelt got all sorts of ire when he invited Booker T. Washington to come to the White House. The first African American to come to the White House, Booker T. Washington, invited by Republican President Teddy Roosevelt, who used him as an advisor. Well, we move on from Roosevelt. We move now, and Roosevelt's appointed a number of blacks in his administration. You move on into Woodrow Wilson. He gets all blacks gone, and he shows a Klan recruiting film at the White House. See, the Klan was an active part of American politics for way too long. By 1875, only a decade after the Civil War, Republicans had successfully passed almost 24 civil rights laws, and black American legislators often played significant roles in the debates surrounding the passage of such laws. One example involved a civil rights bill in 1871, a bill allowing the federal government to punish Klan violence. During the debates on that bill, Representative Joseph Hayne Ramey from South Carolina delivered a powerful speech during the debates on that bill, explaining why blacks were most often the targets of Klan violence.
When we call to mind the fact that this Klan persecution is waged against men for the simple reason that they dare vote with the Republican Party, the question is sometimes asked, why do not the courts of law afford redress? We answer, because the courts are in many instances under the control of Democrats who are wholly opposed to the impartial administration of law and equity. What benefit would result from appeal to courts whose office officers are secretly in sympathy with the very evil against which we are striving. If the Negroes, numbering 1/8 of the population of these United States, would only cast their votes in the interest of the Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended and their rights as American citizens recognized. But I can only say that we love freedom more, vastly more than slavery. Consequently, we hope to keep clear of the Democrats. I will also say that in the state of South Carolina, which I represent, there is no disturbance of an alarming character in any one of the counties in which the Republicans have a majority. The troubles are usually in those sections in which the Democrats have control. I say to the entire membership of the Democratic Party that upon your hands rests the blood of the loyal men of the South. Disclaim it as you will, but the stain is there to prove your criminality before man and God in the world on the day of retribution, which will surely come. I pity the man or party of men who would seek to ride into power over the dead body of a legitimate opponent. I can say for my people that we are fully determined to stand by the Republican Party and the government. We have resolved to be loyal and firm, and as Queen Esther said long ago, if we perish, we perish. I earnestly hope that this bill will pass.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective Black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
As you move forward, you finally get to 1892, and that's the first time the Democrats regain the presidency, Grover Cleveland, the House, and the Senate. They get all of that in 1892. So having regained everything in 1892, now Republicans got it under Abraham Lincoln in 1861. Now Democrats get it back. They repealed every civil rights law. They repealed the Klan laws, the force laws. They repealed the anti-segregation. They repealed everything. So it's gone, and at that point is where you have the real introduction of the black codes. So since all the federal laws are off the books, now you have the southern states that start saying, we'll do a poll tax, we'll do property taxes, we'll do the grandfather clauses. They go through 11 different legal ways to keep blacks from voting in the South. They had literacy tests. Alabama had literacy tests, and you think, well, what's wrong with making sure people can read before they vote? I mean, you got to read the ballot. No. These literacy tests in Alabama were over 20 pages long, and they weren't whether you could read or not. The literacy tests were things like, what rights do you have if you're indicted by a grand jury that's different from being indicted by a regular jury? Who knows the answer to that? But that's what they gave to African Americans, and they gave them such tedious tests that, of course, all blacks turned out to be illiterate. They couldn't vote. They also had what they called hide-and-seek polling places. They had Democrats vote over here, they had Republicans vote over here. Well, they would take the Republican ballots and move them around to different places throughout the day so that you couldn't find where the ballot was. So that was part of what went on. As a matter of fact, lest people think that we're really just kind of picking on stuff here, this is part of the presidential election of 1928. It starts up top. It says, what happened when the Republican Party was in power in Alabama? This is a picture of the 1872 Alabama legislature filled with whites and blacks. They go on and say, now, if you believe in white supremacy, vote the straight Democrat ticket November the 6th. This is not a pejorative. That's a statement of fact. It was not until 1944 the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Democrat policy that said blacks cannot be elected to office as Democrat.
And I heard you correctly. You said 1944.
1944. Now, the first Southern Democrat elected to Congress was in 1972, and that was Barbara Jordan, and that was Andrew Young. Now, how did they get elected out of the South as a Democrat in 1972? Because the Supreme Court had just issued a ruling that told the Democrat legislature of Georgia and the Democrat legislature of Texas to redraw lines so that black could be elected. They gerrymandered lines to keep blacks from being elected. Had it not been for the Supreme Court getting involved and telling the two Democrat legislatures to redraw lines, those two blacks would not have been elected. So the whole black history aspect, it's a very partisan thing, but we hear nothing about it, but it is so well documented. Although history is clear that there have been major differences in how political parties treated black Americans, neither party is completely blameless in all of its actions, nor have all the leaders in a party always been good or always been bad. Understanding this truth, Representative Robert Brown Elliott, even though he was a strong Republican leader in his day, wisely advised,
I'm a slave to principles. I call no political party master. I have ever most sincerely embraced the democratic and representative ideal, not indeed as represented or professed by any political party, but by its true significance as transfigured in the Declaration of Independence and in the injunctions of Christianity.
Elliott's admonition is wise, aligned with political candidates that conform to what he called the injunctions of Christianity. Republican Frederick Douglass, who served as a minister of the gospel, had agreed, declaring,
I have one great political idea. That idea is an old one, is widely and generally assented to. Nevertheless, is very generally trampled upon and disregarded. The best expression of it I found in the Bible. It is in substance, righteousness exalteth a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14 and 34. Now this constitutes my politics, the negative and positive of my politics, and the whole of my politics. I feel it my duty to do all in my power to infuse this idea into the public mind that it may be practiced.
Douglass was right. As citizens, we must vote righteously. And by the way, this first assumes that we are voting. This responsibility to vote and to vote righteously has been made clear from generation to generation. One such voice heralding this responsibility was that of Charles Finney. Finney was a famous American revivalist, a leader in the American revival movement called the Second Great Awakening. He was also the president of a college that even decades before the Civil War admitted both black and white students as equals. Reverend Finney wisely admonished,
the time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this manner, but the time has come when they must act differently. Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics, but I tell you, He does see it, and He will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics.
So when voting, no vote should be cast solely on the basis of any party. The values of each individual candidate must be examined using the standard of biblical righteousness cited by Frederick Douglass, the principles of Christianity as cited by Robert Brown Elliott, and an awareness that voters will answer to God for their vote, as pointed out by the Reverend Charles Finney.
I had no idea that the passage of civil rights only happened under the Republican Party, because today you would think that the Democratic Party would be the one that was really fighting for the civil rights. And so it's again been changed 180 degrees in my mind.
Matt, what you just said about, well, Republicans passed all these civil rights laws, immediately people think, no, wait a minute, time out, that's not right. 1964, the Civil Rights Act, 1965, the Voting Rights Act, that was done by Democrat President Lyndon Baines Johnson. All right, let's talk about that for a minute. You go back to the 64 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act, 64 first and Civil Rights, 65 on voting rights. That was really introduced by Democrat President John F. Kennedy. It was introduced as a result of the riots that occurred in Birmingham. We're having all this racial tension and riots, and he said, we got to do something about this. Let's do the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So these will be the first Civil Rights Acts in 89 years passed by Congress. So what happens is JFK wants to do this, but both of those acts had been previously introduced by Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. They were both killed in the Senate by the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a Democrat. And so now that we've got the racial tension, the Democrats have killed the Civil Rights Act, they've killed the Voting Rights Act, but now we've got this racial tension. The Democrat president says, let's do this. So he goes back to the Republicans and said, your bill, you guys help me do this. So it's moving forward. It comes through LBJ because JFK gets assassinated. So now LBJ picks up the mantle, moves forward with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, it goes into the Congress for a vote. Now, Congress at that time was 2/3 Democrat in the House and the Senate. You got a Democrat president, Democrat House, Democrat Senate, 2/3. It only takes a simple majority to get a bill passed. It only takes 269 votes to pass any bill through the House and Senate if you have control. So they've got 315, they need 269, they got 50, 60 votes to blow. They only came up with 198 votes on the Civil Rights Act. Democrats had it totally in their power to pass the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. According to the records of Congress, they didn't even get close to it. Where'd the help come from? It came from Republicans who overwhelmingly, who voted nearly 83% of Republicans voted for those two acts. Only 62% of Democrats voted for those two acts. Had it not been for Republicans, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 would not have passed.
For more information on the American Heritage Series or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series.
Wow, so, okay, I can't listen to this stuff enough. So if I'm hearing what he's saying correctly, back in the 50s, Eisenhower introduced those civil rights, both of those civil rights bills. But they were turned down, they were voted down by Democrats. And then John F. Kennedy reintroduced them, and he was assassinated. So Johnson picked up that mantle. He reintroduced them. The Democrats voted against it, but the Republicans voted for it. So that it ended up having a majority of votes. So when people are giving the Democrats credit for the Civil Rights Bill, it was actually because of the Republicans. You gotta be careful what you watch on the news. Okay? You gotta be careful what you listen to. And honestly, I had to turn the news off. I just can't justify listening to it anymore because I just don't know what the world, I don't know who's telling the truth anymore. All right, anybody got some thoughts, comments? Brother Cliff.
When I was in high school, was not second, we had a football team that was pretty famous. But every time we had a team from Freeport come to Belmont, it was a battle because of the black people and people. And as a non-Christian, I didn't know. I mean, I just been brought up the way I was, and I looked at them saying, what right do I have to take this attitude? You know, when I got to be in the city mission, I taught people off the streets, other black guys came in, and someone said, I did it the way guy teaches kids, like honest. And I said, listen, I don't know how I feel about this. I said, I was born part of Bohemian, my mother's side, all Bohemian. Some people hate Bohemians. I had no choice in the matter. And I said, for anybody to look at somebody else because of where they came from, what the color of their skin is sinful. It's wicked.
It's not a skin problem, it's a sin.
You know, I said, why can't we just, you know, get along with each other? And you know, those guys said, if anybody comes up against you, let us know.
It's,
That's something else.
I mean, we're all part of the human race.
Yeah, amen.
That's the bottom line. You got Shem, he's the Semitic people, right?
Yep.
Asians, Middle Eastern. You've got Japheth, He's representative of the white folks. We got Ann, representative of black folks. Okay, there really is no color. I mean, the bottom line is that the very name Adam. You know what the very name Adam means? It means red brown clay. Okay, and reddish brown. Okay, and from the reddish brown, it was diversified. Okay, and so, but the bottom line, Adam had a soul, and everyone after him has had a soul. And we just need to look at folks as though they got a soul. And if we can see it, if we can have compassion on, it doesn't make any difference what color you are. You need to have compassion on folks because they got a soul and they need Jesus. Amen. Anybody else got any comments, thoughts, questions? Going once, going twice? All right, well, we're going to be having refreshments in another 5 minutes, I guess, so you're dismissed for the time being, okay? Sorry? There.